Welcome back, everybody, to part 6 of our series as we respond, react, fill in kind of the gaps, and talk about Otto von Bismarck using the original video from Extra History, which the link is in the description below. If you haven't already, please enter our giveaway, which we're giving away 3 copies of the biography of your choice. 3 different people are going to win, and you can choose whatever biography, either in book form through Amazon or in audiobook form from Audible, and I will send that to you just as soon as we hit 50,000 subscribers, which the quicker you guys subscribe and hit that notification bell, the quicker we can get there and give those away. We will definitely be doing more giveaways in the near future, something I want to constantly do because I consider this a collaborative effort, because I'm learning from you guys just as much, hopefully, as you are learning anything new from me. So I want to give back to you guys for all the support that you've been offering to this channel. So we're going to dive into part 6 today. But before we do that, I like to offer just some little tidbits, some information, as I'm sure they will get into eventually, whether it's in this episode or in the next few. Otto von Bismarck eventually was given a hereditary title, the Prince of Bismarck. And I know for all my German friends that I'm not pronouncing that right, that it should be von. It's more of an F sound than a V sound. Forgive my Americanness on that. That's just the way I'm used to saying it. But he was given a princely hereditary title, which has been passed down through his descendants. And there is, to this day, a Prince of Bismarck. The current prince, his name is Karl von Bismarck. He's, I believe, around 60 years old at this point. Has been married several times. In fact, one of his wives was the Miss USA back in the mid-1980s. In fact, she was the first Mexican-American to be awarded the title of Miss USA. His current heir to the Prince of Bismarck is actually a Jewish German. He married an Israeli woman, Prince Karl did, and his eldest son is with that wife, which he's now divorced from. But so kind of cool to see Bismarck, especially because his grandfather was a member of the Nazi Party. Karl's was the previous title holder of Prince of Bismarck. So now the grandson of a Nazi is married to has been married to a Jewish woman, and his heir, the great grandson of that Nazi, will be a Jewish German young man. So I think that's pretty cool to kind of see that come full circle. So we're going to dive into part 6. As always, let me know your thoughts using the comment section below. Let me know what you can add to this. I learned something yesterday that I didn't know, which was that in Germany, the Franco-Prussian War is actually known as the Franco-German War. In France, it's actually known as the War of 1870, which makes total sense that in Germany it would be known as the Franco-German War, because it was more than just Prussia. It was all those southern states as well. And they see that way as the uniting factor. As we're going to see today, it was what united Germany, so it makes sense it would be remembered that way. Let's dive in.
The Prussian army reigned victorious. 250,000 men had surrendered to them, and the French emperor was their prisoner. It was time to make peace. There was only one problem.
With who?
You see, capturing an emperor sounds great. It sounds like the thing that happens when you win. But when the emperor is the state, and he's also your prisoner, who do you negotiate with? This was the problem Bismarck was facing. Too much winning. He wanted to make peace, but they had won so much that he couldn't figure out who to make peace with. So when the news reached Paris on September 2nd, 1870, one of the remaining generals and a few French statesmen declared themselves the government, which they cleverly named the Government of National Defense.
So this is actually kind of foreshadowing a similar issue that happens during World War II, when you have the government of France capitulates to the Germans and sets up a collaboration government, the Vichy government. You have the Vichy France government, which is basically the legitimate government of France at the time. But then you have Free France, and you have Charles de Gaulle setting himself up as the head of Free France. But there's not really been any election. There's no legitimacy to that. So it's a difficult situation for the other allies, because how do they negotiate? How do they deal with this when he really doesn't necessarily have the authority, besides the fact that he just declared himself to be so, and other people may have said that too. So the kind of the same thing happens here, and it's kind of interesting because Prussia wins this war quickly. but then suddenly runs into this issue of negotiation, and it leads to the war lasting much, much longer.
Of course, the emperor was technically still alive and hadn't ever abdicated, which was a complication. Also, they hadn't been elected, so where did their legitimacy come from? Well, everybody basically agreed nowhere. This slapdash government maintained some semblance of control by delivering strong speeches about how France wouldn't give up an inch of territory, to which Bismarck responded, Alsace and Lorraine, please.
And Alsace-Lorraine is the area that they want. And one of the misconceptions that I had for a long time was that the area that Germany takes from France, and that France eventually gets back from Germany in the 20th century, was all of Alsace and Lorraine. And actually it's not. It's only about a quarter of those two regions that Germany actually takes. The rest of Alsace-Lorraine actually stays French.
Negotiations with this pseudo-government quickly fell apart. Moltke was pretty stoked. This meant he would get to march on Paris after all. As the Prussians approached the French capital, the Government of National Defense recalled all of France's armed forces from their colonies, their holdings in Italy, and summoned them to the defense of the homeland. Soon they had a formidable force at Paris, at least on paper, and they began to dig in. But Moltke simply surrounded the capital and laid siege to it. One of the main members of the Government of National Defense pieced out via air balloon to see if he could raise an army in Loire.
He pieced out via air balloon. So balloons actually have their origin in France. In fact, I believe the first time a hot air balloon goes up, and basically the first time that man basically is released from his bonds to the earth, is in the late 1700s. And Thomas Jefferson was actually present for that and witnessed it. They actually show a scene with him and John Adams in the show John Adams, where they witnessed this taking place. By the 1860s, balloons were used regularly during the American Civil War. I think the first time was in the Peninsula Campaign outside of Richmond. And they were used regularly as a way of getting up and getting a better view of the battlefield. Imagine the difference that having that kind of a view makes in being able to determine your strategy. When you can scout where the enemy is, you can actually get above their range of fire.
Everybody else stayed put, defenses raised, just waiting for Moltke to try to storm the city. Moltke had no intention of doing something so blindingly wasteful, though. Instead, he planned to simply let Paris starve and wait them out while the rest of Germany's forces patrolled France, crushing whatever other armies the French put in the field. Bismarck argued that they should shell the city, something that Moltke and the general staff felt was inhumane, against the rules of war, and probably ineffective anyway. But as time wore on, Wilhelm got impatient with the rising costs of this siege and ordered Moltke to listen to Bismarck. There is much debate about how much effect the guns had, and whether it was the shelling or just the starvation that led to surrender, but at last, the Government of National Defense signed an armistice. During these peace negotiations, the representative of the Government of National Defense pleaded with Bismarck, saying that if Paris acceded to all demands, it would cause a socialist revolution. Bismarck coolly replied, "Then I recommend provoking an uprising now while you still have an army to crush it."
And that's actually exactly what happened. I don't know whether they provoked it or not, but right at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, there was, in fact, an uprising. They declared themselves the Paris Commune, and it was several months, I think it was into spring, before they were able to very violently put down that revolt. So they did, in fact, use their army to put down that violence. And this was an issue that France dealt with for several decades to come, having to deal with a very strong socialist leaning among the populace wanting to overthrow the government.
Outplayed at every turn, the Government of National Defense gave Bismarck basically everything he wanted. He got Alsace and Lorraine with nearly 1,700 villages and towns, adding 1.5 million new souls to the German Empire. He got 5 billion francs in gold to be paid as indemnity.
That is... Yeah, somebody mentioned the other day that what happened here was very much like the Treaty of Versailles in terms of how punitive it was. And it gives you a little bit of an understanding of where France is coming from 40 plus years later, when they put punitive damages on the German government. You know, you can kind of understand why they feel the way they do. having Germany hit them with this.
And Prussian troops would be staying in France until that was paid, just in case some real French government came along and tried to go back on their deal. Oh, and also, Bismarck got a German empire. More specifically, he forced the French to officially acknowledge Wilhelm as Kaiser, or Emperor, of Germany.
And that word Kaiser, as well as the word Tsar in Russian, comes from Caesar. So that's kind of why it sounds so similar to that.
The last real step in the unification process. Back when the war first started, the southern German states, the last holdouts, had sort of been absorbed into this growing entity which Bismarck had been putting together. During the war, citizens of Baden or Bavaria or Württemberg had fought side by side with Prussians. It had given them a sense of unity and brotherhood that eclipsed their regional differences.
And yesterday I mentioned about the smallpox outbreak that started because of this war and spread to Germany. Southern Germany wasn't really that badly affected by it because in those southern non-Prussian German states, there had been a mandatory vaccination program against smallpox. And so they actually suffered very few deaths comparatively to what France and Prussia and others in Europe. I think it ended up killing like 500,000 people. It was the last really big outbreak of smallpox before it was eradicated.
Made them an army of Germans fighting together. So now, as the war wound to a close, after experiencing such a great victory through cooperation, these states all voted to become part of something greater, something called the German Empire. Finally, in a scene full of spectacle and drama, on January 18th, 1871, the leading military commanders declared Wilhelm Kaiser in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles.
Isn't it interesting that they declare him Kaiser in Versailles, which is in Paris, right outside of Paris? They did it there, which I thought was kind of interesting. And you may be wondering, too, if you ever hear often the term Third Reich in connection with Hitler's Germany. In the beginning of and up through the end of World War II. This was considered to be the Second Reich, the empire that was created in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian or German-Prussian War. The First Reich, I guess, would be the Holy Roman Empire. I'd have to look that up to be sure, but I'm assuming that's what it would be.
And so the glory of war and the pomp and circumstance of imperial dignity played out. Now all that was left was creating a constitution, which Bismarck expedited by convincing the newly formed German Empire to simply adopt most of northern Germany's previous constitution. But with one interesting proviso. All ministries were under the office of Chancellor, and the Chancellor could propose legislation or bring things to debate in any of the parliamentary houses.
Which is a great idea when you've got a Chancellor like Bismarck. Not such a great idea when you don't have a chancellor like Bismarck. And that's kind of the issue here, is that when you've got a strong leader who's smart, who knows what he's doing, who is capable, that's a great idea. Not so much when he's replaced.
But the chancellorship itself was granted at the direct pleasure of the king. No other body could remove a chancellor or appoint one. Coincidentally, Bismarck just so happened to be the chancellor of Germany. But even with this broad power over his newly formed empire, even now that he was finally ascendant in Germany and Europe at large, Bismarck now faced a challenge that he had never truly had to deal with before. The challenge of governing. Most of Bismarck's life had been focused on unification, on expansion, and on foreign policy. He'd never before really had to focus on questions of domestic policy for Germany.
And that's kind of an interesting thing when you have someone who is so laser focused on a goal. Sometimes they don't necessarily, and I'm not saying Bismarck didn't do this, sometimes they don't necessarily think about what happens when they achieve that goal. They get there and now they're like, okay, now what do I do? You were so focused on getting there and all your energy and all your efforts go into making that happen. When it happens, now what? Now, Bismarck's an educated guy. He's a smart guy. I'm sure he did just fine in that area, but it's an interesting thing to contemplate.
A new Germany, one sewn together out of disparate people of different backgrounds and different faiths. And here perhaps would be his greatest challenge, because now he had to ensure the continued meteoric rise of this new German empire, while at the same time fending off the jealousies of Europe's existing great powers, so that they didn't band together and crush this fledgling nation. This Herculean effort would take him the rest of his life, and for all of its difficulties would be the triumph of his foreign policy and his political philosophy of revolutionary conservatism. But if Bismarck had one great failing, one true tragedy to his life, it would be that he could not envision a world without Bismarck, at least not until it was far too late. And so all of this effort, all of this work he did to ensure a strong but peaceful future for Germany would wash away in other leaders' hands, feeding directly into the looming catastrophes of 1914. But that's a story for another time. Thanks for watching.
Interesting stuff. So I'm assuming there's a part 7. I can't imagine it ends right there. But as always, let me know your thoughts. I would love to hear them. I would love to have you add to the conversation. Let's keep this going. As I mention all the time, I do read every single comment on every single video. I try to react as often as possible, but life goes on. I'm a dad with 3 kids. I'm a husband. I got a lot of other things going on, but I try to check it whenever I can. So rest assured that even if I don't reply, I do read every comment. So please continue the conversation, and we will see you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching.